in your book, Letters to a Young Journalist, you say that journalism is about channeling emotions, not turning them off. And on some rare and extraordinary occasions, it is about tearing down the barrier, what theater people call the fourth wall, separating us from the people and events that we are reporting. If you can't be a person, then you'll ultimately be less of a journalist. You have written a book or multiple books about Jewish history as a member of the Jewish community yourself. And now you've written a couple of books about the civil rights movement as well. Clearly not as an African American. Have you noticed a difference in the way that you had to approach these stories, in the sense that, and you mentioned this in Letters to a Young Journalist as well, that you want to get emotionally involved in Jewish history, but you want to maintain a distance that you stay fair, which is the ethic that you talk about. And was that different from the approach that you had to take when you're researching a story about civil rights movement, where possibly your approach to it can be viewed as antagonistic as well, because it's the classic white savior trope, right?
That's a really great question. I think that from the outside, it probably looks like if I write a book about American Jewry, I'm writing it as an insider. But actually, there are tribes within tribes within tribes. And when I started writing Jew versus Jew, I actually felt very unprepared for that task, because I was very moderately observant in my own religious life. I had never, studied, I couldn't read Hebrew. I'd never studied the Talmud. There are all kinds of ways in which I felt woefully inadequate in terms of having the theological knowledge to be able to write intelligently about the American Jewish experience. And while I felt, because I've always been kind of oriented towards history, on firmer ground in the secular historical aspects of the American Jewish experience, that was still a book that was a big leap for me. And if anything, I think because it was loosely speaking my own community, I felt more like I was going to be a lot more scrutinized if I got anything wrong, and it would be really unforgivable if I got it wrong. Whereas, of course, when I wrote Upon This Rock, my book about a year in the life of a black church, I absolutely wanted to get everything right to show that the white guy could actually learn it and get it right. But also, when I was in settings in and around church doing the research, people didn't expect me to know things. I think my well-intentioned ignorance was more acceptable because I was this white Jewish, and at that point, not religiously observant guy. So I was like a triple outsider. And I think they had, there's a great Yiddish word, Rachmanis. It means having pity. So they had Rachmanis on me. And I think with Jew versus Jew, actually, I was much more in a constant state of shame and embarrassment about all that I didn't know. And it was a gigantic undertaking for me to catch up to it. In terms of being, critical, it was a book that by nature had a lot of critical elements, because I was writing a book about the conflicts within American Jewry, but I also wasn't trying to argue a point of which side in those conflicts was right. That was a book in which I was trying to, because there have been other books that took a more opinionated position, like either the answer is to embrace religion or the answer is to reject religion, and one or the other as an absolute is the way to have a meaningful Jewish life in America. And I wasn't interested in that argument. I was interested in rubbing against each other the different ideas of what it is to be a good Jewish person, what it is to be, a good Jewish congregation or community, and letting that tension exist in the reader's head. And, even in a book like Breaking the Line, look, I think that it's a story of some real heroes, particularly James Harris, the quarterback at Grambling, an amazing figure in American civil rights history for what he accomplished. But you can't just do an airbrush portrait of anybody. And so, for instance, the two head football coaches in that book, Eddie Robinson at Grambling and Jake Gaither at Florida A&M, were tormented by what their role could or couldn't be in civil rights. And I had to be honest about that. They were very divided within themselves. Of course, these were two black men who had master's degrees at a time when maybe 1 or 2% of Black Americans had a master's. They were highly educated men. They were dignified and principled and great husbands and fathers. And yet, so they're role models, walking examples of Black equality to any white person. And yet, because they worked for universities that were controlled by segregationist state governments, they felt they could never take a stand. They were often advising their student athletes, don't protest, don't get involved. Now, some of that was a fear that if you do that, you might get shot down, not an idle fear, or get lynched, not an idle fear. But some of it was that they worried about, I could get, as head coach, fired. The state, the governor, the Board of Regents, they could fire me with the snap of the fingers. And so they had been reluctant for a long time to take a stand. And they were criticized within their own universities by activist students and activist faculty members for not taking a stand. I mean, James Harris recalled to me, coming back, from practice, and Eddie Robinson, the head coach, would give these great patriotic orations to the team, and he certainly felt them. And then Harris and his teammates were watching, had grown up watching Bull Connor turn the water hoses and dogs on the children marching in Birmingham, and countless examples of that. And James Harris said someday he would come home to the dorm and to shake his head and say, Coach Rob sure waves that flag. He was frustrated that this man he admired so much seemed to have a blinkered view of what America was about. Now, ultimately, in their ways, Harris and Gaither, I think, found a way to contribute to the freedom movement. But I couldn't say that just because I'm a white guy writing about Black life, I should aggrandize them falsely. I should ignore I can sympathize as a historian with the incredible difficulty of their position, but I don't come to make excuses for it or to pretend it wasn't there, because there are other coaches, like someone I mentioned earlier, Ori Banks at South Carolina State, who was a member of the NAACP, who, when his student athletes came to him and said, should we protest? He basically said, in almost so many words, you have to be on the right side of history. So there was another way for a football coach at an HBCU to be. And similarly, in writing about Humphrey, I wanted this book to put him back on the historical map in terms of the incredible efforts he made in civil rights. But I was also very conscious throughout my research of this can't be hagiography. It can't be a nomination for sainthood. And I have to always look for where the flaws are. I have to always look for where the feet of clay are, so that it's intellectually honest. And that's why, even though this book is primarily about his role and his allies and his adversaries in the civil rights movement of the 40s, I start out the book with him late in his life with his reputation in tatters. And I give all the reasons why, because I think a reader needed to know that there was a whole other part of his public life that I have to own up to honestly as an author and a biographer. And if you don't do that, then none of lifting up the great work he did is believable at the end of the day.